Hello, my name is Asif Khwaja from ATH Business Solutions. Today I'm going to show you a Power Automate approval workflow. Now, those of you who have been working with SharePoint Designer approval workflows, they know that those SharePoint Designer approval workflows could provide a lot of out-of-box functionality. You could easily create and send the approval tasks to various approvers, and those approvers could either approve or reject those approval tasks. They could even reassign those tasks to other approvers. The original requester could cancel the approval completely. An approver could also request a change from the original requester if they needed some more information to approve that task. And those SharePoint Designer approval workflows could also send reminders to the approvers and dynamically update the approval status along with their comments. Now, building all of this functionality in Power Automate is not an easy task. Even though Power Automate does provide a couple of out-of-box approval actions, but you still have to build this whole functionality from scratch. In this video, we are going to create a Power Automate approval workflow that will have all of those SharePoint Designer functionalities. You will be able to send the approvals to dynamically selected approvers. All approvers will get the approval tasks. They will be able to either approve or reject their task, or even request for a change from the original requester if they need more information to complete their approval. The original requester will also be able to cancel an approval altogether. The workflow will also send regular reminders to those approvers who have not completed their approval tasks. And the workflow will also dynamically update the current status of the workflow along with the approvers' comments who have already completed their tasks. And lastly, but not the least, this workflow will also run beyond 30 days. So if there are a few approvers who have not completed their tasks and the workflow has been running for 30 days, then it will time out. And this workflow will run beyond 30 days timeout period and will complete all the approval tasks. So a lot of work to do. Let's get it started.
Okay, so before we start building our approval workflow in Power Automate, I really want to give a shout out to Reza Dorrani, who is a Microsoft MVP and has created an awesome series of videos on the basic concepts of approvals in Power Automate. I have taken a lot of concepts from his videos for our today's video and have tried to put together all his concepts plus a few new ones into this one consolidated video on approvals with Power Automate. So let's get started with our workflow here. Now for our approval workflow, we are using a travel requests SharePoint list. This is a very basic list with some basic columns here. As you can see, we have a trip title. We have reason for travel, which is just a text field. Requester is a person type. Department, this is a choice column. Now this column is important because the approvers selected for our approval will be based on what department the employee or requester belongs to. So for that one, we have another list on our SharePoint side called Travel Approvers. And as you can see, it contains basic two columns here. The title column, which is the name of the department. And we have the approvers, which is a multi-select person column. And we have two approvers already selected in here, Jack and Chris. We can add as many departments in this list as we want with different approvers for those departments. But for the time being, we have only one department listed here as IT. Back to our travel requests. We have the destination column, which is a location type of column. So we can store any locations or addresses in this column. Then we have travel start date and travel end date columns. These store the dates information. We have travel duration in days, which is simply a calculated column and calculates the difference between these two dates in days. And then we have an airline column, which is just a choice type of column with names of different airlines. Estimated airfare is the currency type of column. And then we have a status column, which will store the current status of the approval. So initially when a new item is created, this will contain the status new. And if I show you other statuses in this column, you will see we have a new status, and then as the approval starts, the status will change to pending. And if all of the approvers have approved, the status will change to approved. If any of the approvers have rejected, the status will change to rejected. And if the original requester cancels the approval, the status will change to cancelled. Next, we have a column called approval comments. This is a multi-line text field, and this column we will use to store all the comments provided by the approvers and the approval history. I would actually like to create two more columns for the purpose of our workflow. The first column will be of a single line of text type, and I will call this Start Workflow. Now this column we will use to control the execution of our workflow, for example, beyond 30 days, or whether we want to restart our workflow or not. We are not providing any default values. The column is empty initially. So let's save this one. And lastly, we want to create another column, and I will create this one of multiple lines of text type, and I will call it Approvers Done. So we will discuss this in a lot more detail later, but for now just keep in mind that this column will be used to track the information of which approvers have completed their part and which ones are remaining. Okay, so let's save this column. So now we have all the columns that we needed for our approval workflow. Another thing that we want to keep in mind is that we do not want this approval workflow to start when an item is created. We want to allow the employee or the user to create this item and make as many changes as they want before actually manually starting the approval workflow. All right, so let's jump to our Power Automate portal here, and let's start our new workflow. And we will use the instant cloud flow for our purpose here, and we will call this one Start Approval. And the trigger that we will use will be for a selected item. So let's choose that one and click on Create. We will provide the name of our SharePoint site, which is called Classic Site in our environment. And then we will choose the name of our list, which is Travel Requests. We will add another action and we'll call it Get Item. And we will choose our SharePoint site again, Classic Site. And the name of the SharePoint list, which is Travel Requests. And it requires the ID of the item that we want to get from that list. And the ID is coming from the trigger, which is for a selected item. And we will choose that ID here. Next, what we want to do is, once we have got the item, we want to update the status from new to pending. So we will use the update item action. Once again, we will choose the name of our SharePoint site and the SharePoint list, which is Travel Requests, and the ID again, which is coming from the get item action. So we will use that ID from get item action. Now here we will update a couple of fields here. We can leave all of these fields to their default values, but as you can see, we have a status value field here, which is showing new because that's a default value. We will change it to pending because as our approval workflow starts, we want to change the status to pending. And then we have the approval comments field here, which we will use to store our comments or history of our approval workflow. So we can say approval started by, and we could give the name of the person or the requester. So for that, we will use we have a field requester column in our SharePoint list, and we will use the display name. And then after that, within these brackets, we could display the current time. I can write UTC now function, which will display the current date and time, but in UTC format, which may not look as good as we would want. So we can use a convert from UTC function, and this requires a timestamp, which we have already provided. And then it requires the destination time zone string thirdly, it requires the format in which we want to display the date. And we will use dd mmm YYYY, and then we also want to display the time, so I will say h mm, and then to display whether it's an AM or PM value, I could use TT. So these are the format describers that we can use for our current date. And then lastly, we need to close the bracket for our convert function. And let me define the time zone value, which I will copy and paste from here. And in my case, this is going to be Australian Eastern Standard Time, as I'm in Australia, in Sydney. So I want to display the date in Australian time zone. So I will click on update. And like Reza, I will also use some graphical indicators here to display the status of our workflow. So because we are just starting, we will use this icon here to just indicate that the workflow has just started. Now for these two columns that we created, start workflow, which was initially empty, let's put yes in this one because we do want to start our workflow. And I will explain in a while how this works, so please don't worry about it if you don't get it now. For the approvers done, because we don't have any approvers done anything yet, so we need to keep this field empty, but by default this value contains null value, which is not what we may want. So we will simply put a semicolon here, for example, because we will be storing email addresses of the approvers in this field separated by semicolons anyways. So we will simply put one semicolon in here so that we make sure that there is no null value stored in this field here. All right, so let's save our workflow. The flow is called start approval, and this is all we need in this flow. And you will be thinking, is that it? No, of course, that's not it. This is only one small part. The approach that we are taking in this video is that we will be building two workflows. One of them is this one, very simple, which will be triggered by the user from the SharePoint list. And when this workflow runs and updates the item, the updating of the item will trigger another workflow that we are going to build. And that workflow will contain all of the approval logics and functionality that we want to build. Okay, so let's have a look at this one first. The name of the workflow is start approval. So if we go back to our travel requests list now, you will see that when I select an item that I want to start the workflow for, and I click on automate, you will see that now we have the start approval workflow option available here, which we can click on and we can start the approval workflow. But we will wait for our other workflow to be built and then we will come to this one. And also remember that this option of starting the approval workflow can also be displayed in a column in the form of a button here, which the user can simply click on that button to start the workflow rather than selecting an item here and then going into the automate option and then clicking on start approval. Now we will not do this here because there are lots of other resources available that can teach you how to do that, but we will focus only on our main approval workflow. All right, so back to our Power Automate portal here, and we will now go and create our next flow. This one was called start approval. Now we want to create a new automated cloud flow because we want to automatically start it when a new item is not created but is modified. So let's see if we have a trigger for modified. And we have, this one is called when an item or a file is modified. So this trigger will only run when the item is modified. This will not run when an item is created. Okay, so this is the one that we are using here. The name of the workflow we will call approval workflow and we'll click on create. Once again, we will select our SharePoint site and the name of the list for which we want to run this workflow. The list is called travel requests. Now this flow will trigger every time the item in this list is modified, which is not what we want, right? So when the first time a new item is created, the status will be new. And when the user manually starts the workflow, which is the start approval workflow, this workflow will actually change the status to pending. So in our approval workflow, we will define a trigger condition for this trigger, in which we want that this should only trigger when the status is not new. Either it's pending or something else, that's fine. But if the status value is new, we do not want this trigger to trigger. So we have the settings option here, and in the settings of the trigger, we can actually add our condition here. Now this condition needs to be in the Power Automate expression format here, and the easier way to write this expression here is that if we can just add another action called do until, for example, and in this one we can say that the status value, so that's the status column of our SharePoint list that contains various statuses. We will choose that, and then we could say if the status value is not equal to new. Now there is apparently a bug here that is preventing us from selecting these conditions, but if I click on advanced mode, then you can see that I can see that condition. And now if I just type in any value between these two single quotes, let's say n, and then I click on basic mode, and then you can see that both of these fields start working now. So if we say if the status value is not equal to new, so that's our trigger condition that we can use in our trigger. So I will simply copy that and go into our trigger settings and add that condition here. Now this is telling Power Automate that only run this flow when the status value of the SharePoint list is not equal to new. If it is new, then this condition will never meet, and then the flow will never run. So this will allow the user or the employee who is creating that travel approval request in SharePoint to not only just create it, but also modify it as many number of times as they want before manually starting the approval workflow. Now there is one more thing to keep in mind, is that we also do not want this workflow to start if our start WF field has a value of no. If this column says no, then we also don't want our main approval workflow to start. And as mentioned earlier, this is the column that we will use to control the execution of our workflow beyond 30 days, as well as for a few other things in our workflow. So initially, when the item is created, as you can see, the start workflow column has no value. It's empty, it's blank, which means it doesn't have the value no, right? So we can write another condition here in our basic mode. We could say that the start WF is not equal to no. So this is another condition that we want to put in our trigger there. And now if I copy this condition also, and let me open my notepad because we need to merge these two conditions together. So that's the second condition, and the first condition is there in our trigger. So I'll just go there and copy that one also. The first condition says if the start WF column is not equal to no. So that's first condition. And then we want to add an and with this. So after this add sign, we will say and then that's one condition. And then after this condition, we will put a comma, and then we will remove this add sign and bring in this second condition here. And then we will close this and bracket at the end. So this and has now two conditions. The first condition is this one, which says that the start workflow column should not be no, and then comma, and then second condition is this one, which says that the status value should not be new. And both of these conditions are and, that means both of these conditions should be true in order for the workflow to run. So we will copy that and replace this one with this new trigger condition, and we will say done. All right, so now our workflow will only run when the item's status is not new and the start workflow column's value is not no. And initially, even though the start workflow value is not no, which will allow that trigger to run, but then the other condition of the status is new, which will not meet there because the condition says that the status should not be new. So this will allow the user to open up this item as many times and update it as many times as they like and save it back before starting the approval workflow. And please don't worry if you do not understand the logic behind these columns here, because as we proceed in our workflow, the usage of these columns will become much clearer. All right, so our trigger is there. We have defined our trigger conditions. This do until now we don't need because we only created this one to get our condition formatted properly. Now, as soon as this workflow triggers, we want to get the names of the approvers. And the names of the approvers are sitting in our SharePoint list. So we'll use the action get items. We will choose the name of the SharePoint list from here, which is travel approvers. And we will need to provide a condition here, a filter that fetch only the rows where title is equal to, and if you look at our approvers list here, travel approvers, we have the title that has the name of the department. And in our request that was being created, the name of the department was also there in the department column for that user who created this request. So we can say in our workflow, bring in only those approvers where the department value is equal to the title in that list. So we can rename this action to get approvers. Now obviously this get approvers will return only one row, which will contain the names of all those approvers for that department. But then we need to extract their email addresses so that we can use those email addresses for our approvals. So for that, we will need a few variables and we will need to do some data manipulation to extract those email addresses from there. So let's create a variable and we will call it var approver emails, and this will be of type string. Initially, we will leave it empty, so that's fine. And just to make sure that we identify the variable name from here. And then we will create another variable and we will call this one approver emails array. And I will select the type array for this one. Now I'm creating two variables. One is the string variable, which will actually contain the email addresses of the approvers separated by semicolons. And this variable will be an array that will contain the email addresses of those approvers. Now we will need both of these types of variables in our flow. That's why we are creating them, and you will see that how we use them. So let's first populate our array variable here. Now we need to extract the email addresses from our get approvers action. And you can see that in our travel approvers list, we have a column called approvers that contains the names of those approvers there. And remember, this is a person type of column. This is not a text column. Okay. If I choose approvers here, then this approvers will go in here and it will actually create a loop kind of condition, which is not what we want. We need to extract the values of these approvers. So I will actually go into the expression mode, and then in the expression, I will type bracket and then go to the dynamic content. And from the get approvers action, I will choose the value. Now the value is the one that returns a list of all the items that this get approvers action returns. So I will choose that. And then I can type in a question mark. And within this array elements, I can say pick up the element number 0 because there will be only one element that this get approvers action returns. And from that element, then we want to pick up the values of approvers. Once I have written this expression, I don't need these enclosing brackets at the end and at the start. So we can simply write outputs and now click on OK. And then we have got this expression here that will retrieve the approval records from our get approvers action. Now from each of those approval records, we need to extract the emails of those approvers. So for that, we will use the select action. And now in this one, we will give it the name of this variable that contains the output of that action. So the name of our variable is array. And now in the key value mapping, let's just change it to just mapping. And we need to extract from each of these records just the email. So I will go to the expression and I will write item. The item function always represents the current value or record which is being provided through this array. And then from that item, we need to extract the email. So we could say a question mark. And the email is in the format of this one. So if we click OK, and that's where it's going to extract all the email addresses for our approvers. Now let's pause here and test our workflow to see whether we are able to extract our approvers' email addresses correctly. So because this is the first time that we will be running our workflow, we will actually need to run the workflow from our SharePoint list. So let's go to our SharePoint list. Let's quickly create a new item. We will give it a trip title. Reason could be to attend a conference. Requester is myself, so I will choose my name there. Department, for the time being, we will choose IT because that's the only department that we have approvers for. But you can choose HR and marketing also and define their respective approvers in the approvers list there, and that will work as expected. So right now we will just choose IT. Destination is London, and we will just choose the first value there in United Kingdom. Travel dates, we can say, okay, 22nd of September to 29th of September. Airline, we can choose British Airways. We are going to London. Estimated airfare could be, let's say, $1,500. Status would be new. There are no approval comments yet. And these values, as you can see, which we created for our approval workflow to function correctly, you can always hide them from this form here. They can work in the background. The user doesn't need to see these columns, but for our purpose, we will keep them here so that we can check them. Let's click on save. So the item has been created here. No workflow will trigger yet because the workflows that we created will trigger only when the item is modified or when someone manually starts a workflow. All right, so let's start the workflow manually for this new item. I will go into automate and click on start approval. And because we are running this one for the first time, it will check for the connection permissions. We'll click on continue and then click on run flow. Now remember that when this workflow runs, it only runs our first part of the workflow, which does these things, changes the status to pending, also puts approval comments, that the approval started by Asif Khwaja, and that was the time, so we can make it a little bigger to just see all those comments properly appearing here. The start workflow, that value has changed to yes, and the approvers done column has a semicolon in it. Remember, we just populated it with a semicolon in that workflow. Now, as soon as this workflow completes and updates this item, this update will trigger the execution of this particular workflow. So let's see if this workflow has run yet. It hasn't run yet. Let's go and check our other workflow, the start workflow. And we can see that it completed successfully. So this workflow started for the selected item and got the value of that item. And then lastly, it updated that item with our comments and all that. So that workflow ran correctly. And looking at our other workflow, which is the actual approval workflow, we can see that it did run but failed. So let's see where it failed. So our trigger executed correctly, but our get approvers action failed. So let's see where it failed. The error says column IT doesn't exist. Right, okay, so let's see what we have done wrong. In our get approvers actions, we were getting the item from our travel approvers, and we had a condition called title equal the department. Now because the department value is a text type of value, we need to enclose it with single quotes. That's the mistake that we made. So let's save it again. And now because we have run this workflow at least once, we can always go and test it from here. So that's the one instance that failed. So let's test that again. And it ran successfully this time. So we picked up all of our approver records from our list, and we initialized our variable. So this variable was empty. We haven't done anything with that yet. The array one is the one that picked up all of the approver records. So we have two approvers. So you can see we have an email address of Jack Black, and we also have an email address of Chris Green there. And then in this select item, what we were doing, we were retrieving the email property from both of these items. So let's see what select shows us. The select's outcome is an array of the email addresses of our approvers. So that all looks good so far. Our workflow trigger and trigger conditions are fine. Get approvers gets all the approvers, and then we retrieve those approver email addresses into our array with this select action. And now from this select action, we will also populate our string variable, which is the approver email addresses. So that will be very easy to do. So we can say set variable, and the variable name is this, and we can, from this select action, we can write an expression, and we could say join. And you know that the output of this select action is an array of all the email addresses. So we will simply select that. And then the join function needs a delimiter with which you want to join all of those email addresses. So we will tell it a semicolon. So we want all of the email addresses to be joined by a semicolon. So let's click OK. And then we can put another set variable action to properly populate our emails array variable with the output of this select, which is basically an array of all the email addresses. So now we have two set variable actions. One of them is storing all the approver email addresses delimited by semicolons in this string variable. And then we have this array variable that contains the list of all the email addresses, the approvers' email addresses, in the form of an array. So let's test our workflow one more time. Let's save it and test it. And now you can see we have the string variable populated with email addresses, and we have the array variable properly populated with the list of those email addresses. Now that we have captured the approvers' email addresses, we can start building our approval workflow to send them the approval tasks. And that is what we will do in the part 2 of this video series. I will put the link in the description. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.